Now, when we talk about evidence-based, factors or evidence-based elements, many of us are familiar with the term evidence-based practices, and not every evidence-based process of determining what's evidence-based is created equal. And so there's three that are shown on this slide. The first one is the kind of the bar that the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration of the federal government has put out there, by which a practice can earn its way onto the National Registry of Evidence-Based Programs and Practices, or NREP. And that web address is there for you to look at. And then there's a little bit more rigorous, and we're going to talk about what each of these three actually looks like in a minute. But moving from least rigorous to most rigorous, second here is the APA Division of Clinical Psychology Subcommittee on Research-Supported Treatments, okay? And so to be able to have an intervention or a modality earn the label research-supported treatment, a little bit more rigorous threshold had to be met. And then the last one is the way in which these elements that we're going to be talking about in our session today have come to be known as evidence-based. And as you'll see, they had to pass a pretty rigorous set of criteria in order to be accorded evidence-based relational factors. So when I first encountered this many moons ago, I was impressed by the rigor with which the research took place and the honesty with which it really teased apart and called it like it found it, at least in this set of research studies, and we'll be able to work our way through some of that as we go forward. So the National Registry on Evidence-Based Practices. In order to be listed on the registry that SAMHSA maintains, you need to have at least one duplicated clinical trial that shows a statistically significant treatment effect for whatever the intervention or modality is, okay? So let's say I'm a clinician and I stumble upon or invent or create or pull together an intervention that I just think is really good, better than what's been there before. And I do a study and it demonstrates that yes, the impact of my intervention is better than placebo, it's better than the equivalent of a sugar pill, it's statistically significant. In order to be listed on NREP's registry, an independent researcher other than me has to go ahead and duplicate the design of that intervention and studying its impact on the people who are engaged in it. And so that would be the duplicated trial, okay? The second thing that NREP requires is that the findings be published in a peer-reviewed journal. And the thinking behind that is, peers in any given human services discipline are pretty savvy about their field, and they can reason check the research that they're reviewing and ask the right questions and ask, be critical, be constructively critical as needed in order to make sure that the thing is legit before it would be published in one of these peer-reviewed journals. And so that was another criteria there for an NREP listing. And then lastly, in the service of SAMHSA's mission to push out effective practices to shorten the science to services gap, as sometimes it's called, there needs to be the provision of implementation materials, like how do you get a hold of the guts of whatever that intervention or model is, and how do you deploy them to train up staff and make sure that it's being delivered sufficiently, with sufficient fidelity. How do you support it with whatever materials may be involved? So SAMHSA required that any modality that meets the NREP criteria would have to have that kind of material already developed. Many of them have toolkits or manuals or qualified people who are available to train and teach them. And so but that's the NREP bar. It's not terrible. It's not the most rigorous one out there. Comparatively speaking, the Subcommittee on Research-Supported Treatments requires more than just one clinical trial or duplicated clinical trial, at least two. So 2 or more clinical trials, which, like the one clinical trial, duplicated clinical trial that I've already described, would show a treatment effect better than placebo, better than chance. And then there has to be independent investigators in each trial. So you can't have the same investigator doing multiple trials on their own intervention, for example, to guard against the bias that they may have of wanting it to be successful and consciously or unconsciously slanting things in that direction so that the outcome goes that way. And then for the third criteria is it has to be manualized. And the thinking behind manualization or having a toolkit is that if it's going to be useful to the field, it needs to be able to be standardized in a way that it can be taught so that people who don't know how to do it can learn in an objective, standardized way so that the practitioner lives over in Oregon who is trained up on a manualized intervention, delivers it in largely the same way as the clinician here in Michigan who has been taught or trained up according to that manualized, kind of objectively standardized version. And there's pros and cons to that, but for the purposes of replicating an effective treatment intervention and pushing it out to the practitioner world so that it can be useful in helping clients move forward toward their recovery goals, manualization it serves that purpose. So that's a little bit higher bar because it requires more clinical trials. What about the bar that was used for the research that we're about to dive into here? The Task Force on Evidence-Based Therapy Relationships. When they commissioned the research that has happened in the past, since 2001 or 2, they wanted to be very rigorous so that their findings were above reproach and would be taken seriously. And so many of them looked at existing research studies and did what sometimes is called a meta-analysis or a meta-review of multiple different research studies that each have their own design but are kind of pointing to the same goal or answering the same question. And so they looked at very comprehensively a meta-analysis of many, many pre-existing research studies as well as initiating new research. They looked at multiple treatments. So what are the relational elements that emerge across multiple treatments or modalities in order to control for the actual relational factor to be able to get an objective reckoning of how important it was in its contribution to a good outcome for the consumer. And then because it wasn't possible to do double-blind clinical trials, right? And why that isn't possible with this sort of research is because, so we're going to be talking about empathy, for example, as one of those relational factors. It wouldn't be ethical to deliver an empathy-rich intervention or an empathy-rich version of an intervention and then withhold empathy intentionally from a control group. That would not be ethical, right? If you know that something is helpful and you intentionally withhold it, maybe 50 years ago, there are some research studies that come to mind where, that kind of harm, by omission was done in the name of research, but by today's standards, there's no institutional review board that would look at the potential impact on your human subjects and say that was okay to do. So that wasn't possible, but at the same time, that avoided some of the pitfalls of doing double-blind studies as well. So fairly rigorous set of conditions had to be met in order for something to be deemed impactful relational factor with a treatment effect that was of whatever strength, more statistically significant than placebo or than treatment as usual. So there's a couple of, if you're a research-minded person or want to dig into some of the research that's out there, you can read all about all of the research done behind this task force on evidence-based therapy relationships at the URL that's on your screen right there. And then there's another really nice set of research studies, and this is a little bit off topic, but I wanted to introduce it at least. The United Kingdom has what's sometimes known as a socialized medicine kind of arrangement, and so the state sponsors all of the services that are delivered to what we would call the public sector behavioral health populations. And because the state funds all that, drives all that, they are also uniquely positioned to study all that as well in a way that's more direct access to data, more comprehensive data sets than is possible right now with the healthcare system that we have in the United States. And so the Effectiveness Bank, as it's called, has done an incredible amount of research on drug and alcohol use, drug and alcohol treatment interventions, using that very significant data set and access to complete and robust data set in the United Kingdom. And so I offer that to you as well if you're interested in digging more into this type of research as it pertains to addiction disorders or just additional research in general for drug and alcohol interventions.